The guard's voice was clipped and impersonal. "Restricted area, sir. Military service only. If your name's not on the list, I can't let you in." The man standing before him looked out of place. Not because he was hostile or disruptive, he wasn't. He stood in silence, posture straight but weary, like time had carved its initials across his back. His jacket, once a deep olive, had faded with decades of wear. His boots, shined with care, bore scuffs no polish could hide. In his weathered hand, a single lily drooped gently in the breeze. Beyond the gates, reporters jostled, flags lifted in the wind, and cameras clicked in unison as a brass band played a slow military dirge. Inside, the funeral of General Elijah Monroe was underway, an event lined with the elite of Washington's military circle. This was a man whose legacy spanned continents, who had advised presidents and commanded thousands. His send-off was nothing short of presidential, but outside the fence no one saw the old man standing quietly. No one except the general about to change everything. The setting was Arlington Ridge, late September, the morning air sharp with the first bite of fall. Maple trees flushed orange and gold flanked the marble walkways like sentries. The old man's name was Curtis Dean. He had traveled nearly 300 miles that morning from a quiet rural town in West Virginia. 2 bus rides, 1 layover, and a half-mile walk from the last station. He hadn't called ahead. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. He didn't expect a seat or even a nod. All he wanted was to leave the flower and say goodbye. Curtis stepped forward, his movement slow but deliberate. "Do you have identification?" the security officer asked, scanning the guest list on his clipboard. "No," Curtis replied calmly. "I just came to pay my respects. I served with General Monroe a long time ago." The guard paused, glanced up, then shook his head. "I'm sorry, sir. This is a private service." Curtis nodded. No protest, no frustration. He simply stepped back and stood just off the path, resting near the stone wall that lined the cemetery's edge. He stayed there still and silent as the bugler played and the crowd inside took their seats. Inside the gates, Colonel Jason Aldridge noticed something odd, an elderly figure just beyond the fence. The silhouette stirred a memory. The patch on his shoulder, an outdated insignia from the 19th Recon Division, decommissioned in 1976. He squinted. The man's name rushed back with clarity. Curtis Dean. The same man General Monroe had credited with dragging him out of a firefight in Laos in 1971. Aldridge turned to General Malcolm Rains, who stood near the casket, hands clasped. "Sir," Aldridge said, voice low. "He's here." "Who's here?" the general asked, eyes narrowing. "Dean. Sergeant Curtis Dean." Without hesitation, General Rains turned and handed his ceremonial gloves to an aide. The brass band faltered. The priest hesitated. The crowd murmured as the general broke formation, walking briskly across the open field to the outer gate. Curtis looked up in quiet confusion as the gate opened. General Rains came to a stop and raised his hand in a sharp salute, as clean and deliberate as the first one he ever gave. "Sergeant Dean," Rains said, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for coming." Curtis blinked. "You didn't have to stop everything." "With all due respect," the general said, "I did." He gestured to an officer beside him, who stepped forward and offered a small, polished wooden box. "General Monroe left instructions. He wanted you to carry him home." Curtis stared at the box, stunned. "He remembered?" The general's jaw clenched. "He never forgot." Before we continue the story, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel. It really helps us keep making stories like this. Curtis took the box, his hand trembling. As he stepped through the gate, the entire procession came to a halt. Soldiers and senators stood in silence. Former presidents in attendance lowered their heads. The bagpipes paused. The chaplain stepped back, and for a moment the ceremony was no longer for General Monroe. It was for the man who once carried him through the jungle. Curtis placed the urn on the flag-draped pedestal. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. The silence around him carried more weight than any prepared statement could. He stayed by the casket long after the official rites ended. People came and went. Some saluted him, Others offered a quiet nod. One by one, the remaining veterans of Monroe's original unit, now gray-haired and stooped, formed a line behind him. Without cue, they raised their hands in solemn salute. The past had returned, not with fanfare, but with dignity. Later that afternoon, long after the chairs were cleared and the reporters left, Curtis remained by the grave. A single incense stick burned softly at the edge of the headstone. "You always did hate flowers," he muttered, placing the wilted lily beside the urn. A familiar voice broke the silence behind him. Sergeant Dean. He turned. General Rains stood there, not in parade form, but in a light overcoat, the stiffness of command now replaced with quiet humility. "I've got something for you," Rains said, offering a sealed envelope. "General Monroe left this. Told me to give it to you only if you made it to the end." Curtis took the letter. His fingers trembled as he unfolded the paper. The ink had smudged slightly over the years, but the message was clear. "Curtis, I lived a life of medals and speeches, but I only ever had one debt that mattered. You carried me out of hell when no one else could, and you never let me thank you. This is my attempt. I hope you forgive me for making it so late. E." Curtis folded the letter, tucking it into his coat. He didn't cry. He simply nodded once, the way soldiers do when words aren't enough. 1 year later, on the outskirts of Richmond, a new center opened, the Curtis Dean Veterans Home. Counseling, physical therapy, housing, and a garden with engraved stones of unnamed heroes. Funded by the Monroe Foundation, approved by Congress, and standing off to the side at the ribbon cutting, not in the spotlight, not at the podium. Curtis Dean, he held no speech, only a worn hat in his hand. And when asked why he never stood in front, he replied, "I've already been seen. Once was enough. And maybe that's all anyone ever needs. Just once to be remembered." If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments. The Curtis Dean Veterans Home was quiet the morning after its grand opening. The breeze carried the scent of newly cut grass and warm wood stain from the outdoor benches. A few early visitors walked the garden path where small bronze plaques were embedded in the stone wall. No names, only service units and years that spanned nearly a century. Inside, young men and women in uniform, some using canes, others in therapy chairs, moved through the corridors without fanfare. The walls displayed more than medals or photos. They told untold stories, fragments of sacrifice and dignity. Curtis arrived just after sunrise. No fanfare, no escort. He wore the same coat he had at the funeral, his steps slower now, though still steady. The receptionist recognized him immediately and nodded with a quiet respect. He nodded back, gave no speech, just made his way to the garden where a single stone bore the inscription, "Charlie Squad, Laos, 71. He sat on the bench facing it, his lily now dried but still intact, pressed carefully between 2 pages of a folded field journal. Across the courtyard, General Rains watched. He didn't approach. Not yet. Some things didn't need ceremony. But when a young corporal approached Curtis to thank him, stammering, nervous, clearly a recent resident, Curtis smiled, gave a short nod, and said simply, "We all carry something. Just try not to carry it alone." Back in D.C., the story of General Monroe's funeral had spread far beyond the military channels. A viral clip of General Rains opening the gate for Curtis had been shared over 5 million times. But Curtis never commented. He didn't give interviews. He refused all invites to sit for podcast interviews or veteran spotlight panels. What mattered had already happened. And to him, that was the point. Service without spotlight. 3 months passed before another letter arrived. It bore the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside, an invitation to speak at the National Day of Remembrance for Unrecognized Servicemen. Curtis read it over a cup of black coffee, chuckled to himself, and folded it shut. "They always wait too long," he said, setting it on the counter. But later that night, he placed it on the mantel next to the urn. Monroe's ashes now interred, but a small brass keepsake still sat in Curtis's home, gifted by the general's family. At the ceremony, Curtis didn't speak long. He stood at the podium, cleared his throat, and began in his usual grounded tone. I don't have a story you haven't heard before. Most of us don't. The difference is someone finally listened. He paused. The crowd was silent. You want to honor soldiers? Start with the ones who come home invisible, the ones who never made it to rank, who don't have books written about them. They're standing in line at the grocery store behind you, or sitting alone at a bus stop wearing a hat with a patch you don't recognize. He stepped down without applause, only a gentle silence that lingered even as the next speaker was called up. A week later, a young reporter showed up at Curtis's front porch. She knocked twice and waited, camera gear tucked in her tote bag. When he opened the door, she said, I'm not here for a headline. I just want to understand how you carried all of this all these years. Curtis didn't slam the door. He just stepped out, sat on the porch swing, and motioned for her to sit. You want to know the truth? He asked. She nodded. I didn't. Carry it alone. I just didn't talk about it. That single sentence led to a 12-minute feature piece titled, The Man Who Walked Without Applause. It wasn't flashy. It didn't trend for long, but it ended up archived in the National Museum of Military History, one of the rare entries made at the request of enlisted men, not officers. As time passed, Curtis visited the Veterans Center weekly. He never missed a day when new recruits came through the door. Some saluted him without knowing why. Others sat beside him during lunch and talked about things they hadn't told their families. One even said, I don't think I belong here. Curtis looked at him and said, neither did I, until someone told me I did. The power wasn't in the building. It wasn't in the story that went viral. It was in the way people looked at him now, not like a relic or a burden, but like a man whose silence had shaped something lasting. It was the unspoken knowledge that sometimes the men who don't ask for recognition are the ones who shape entire generations. Curtis's walks to the center became a routine part of local life. Shopkeepers along the route often greeted him with respectful nods, and a few townsfolk even started leaving small thank you notes on the bench near the entrance. He never made a show of reading them, but every now and then one would disappear, tucked into his coat pocket without a word. The younger veterans, many battling unseen injuries, began referring to him simply as Sarge. It wasn't official. It wasn't forced. It just stuck. One rainy Thursday afternoon, a new name appeared on the intake list. Private Evan Holbrook, 24, medically discharged after a vehicle ambush overseas. He arrived with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and eyes that didn't settle anywhere for long. Curtis watched from his seat near the window as Evan stood awkwardly in the lobby, unsure of where to go. He recognized the look, lost but pretending not to be. Without being asked, Curtis rose and walked over. First time's the hardest, he said gently. Evan turned. I'm not sure I belong here. Curtis didn't respond with sympathy. He simply gestured toward the hallway. Let's find you a room. That small moment turned into something more. Over the next several weeks, Curtis and Evan fell into a quiet rhythm. Morning coffee in the courtyard, short walks down the path. Even a few shared meals. Evan never spoke about what happened. Curtis never pushed. But one afternoon, Evan sat beside him under the pergola, stared ahead and said, I was the only one who made it out. Sometimes I wish I hadn't. Curtis let the silence hold. Then, finally said, You did make it out, that counts. What you do next, that's what matters now. It was the first of many quiet conversations that wouldn't be recorded, broadcasted, or posted, but would be remembered by the ones who needed them most. Curtis also began organizing a small woodworking group. Nothing fancy, just a handful of residents using donated tools to shape rough blocks into keepsake boxes, flag frames, and walking sticks. For many, the slow, steady sound of sandpaper and chisels became therapy without having to name it. And for Curtis, it was a way to give his hands something to do, while his mind sorted through years of things left unsaid. One particular Saturday, The group built a memorial bench carved with the words, "For the ones who didn't make it home and the ones who did, but still carry the weight." It was placed beneath the oldest oak on the property, facing the veterans' garden. Curtis didn't take credit, but his initials were burned discreetly on the underside. As the seasons turned, the center grew. Funding increased. Local high schools began offering volunteers to serve meals. Retired nurses helped with wellness checks. A local photographer even offered to take portraits. Professional, dignified, black and white photos for those who never had one taken in uniform. Curtis refused the first 3 invitations. "I don't need a picture," he said. But on the 4th try, when a young Navy vet named Sam asked him personally, he finally agreed. The portrait session was simple. No flash, no fuss. Just Curtis, seated on a wooden stool, his hands folded on his lap, that same faded coat over his shoulders. The final image, once printed and framed, was quietly placed in the front hallway of the center. The plaque read, "Curtis Dean, founder, sergeant, friend." On Veterans Day, a small ceremony was held in the center courtyard. There were no fireworks, no marching bands, just an acoustic rendition of taps, a few poems read by residents, and one moment of silence that lasted longer than usual. Afterward, Curtis stood off to the side as he always did. One of the younger residents approached with a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. "It's from my dad," the young man said. "He served in Vietnam, said he saw you once. K-san, 68. Never forgot it." Curtis opened the note. Later that night, sitting at his kitchen table, the handwriting was shaky but clear. "You pulled 3 men out of a crater that day. I was the 4th, buried under them. You didn't know I was there, but you saved me anyway. I owe you my life." Curtis stared at the paper for a long time before folding it and placing it beside the letter Monroe had written. That night he didn't sleep much, but he didn't feel alone either. Winter came early that year. The first snowfall blanketed the Veterans Center in silence. Curtis arrived with his collar turned up against the cold and a small bag of tools tucked under his arm. The wooden bench beneath the oak had begun to weather. Nothing severe, just enough that he noticed. He spent the morning sanding the seat smooth again, his breath rising in soft clouds. A few passers-by offered to help, but he waved them off with a half-smile. "Just keeping the memory warm," he said. That same week, General Rains visited the center. It wasn't a scheduled event. He came alone, no camera crew, no assistants. He found Curtis in the rec room, quietly helping one of the residents adjust a crooked picture frame. "I thought I'd find you here," the general said. Leaning on the doorway, Curtis looked up, nodded once, and went back to adjusting the frame. When he was satisfied, he turned and motioned toward the hallway. "Let's walk." They moved through the center at an easy pace. Rains took everything in, the new additions, the handmade plaques, the wall of black and white portraits lining the main hallway. "You've built something powerful here," he said softly. "I didn't build anything," Curtis replied. "I just didn't leave." They reached the garden and stood by the bench. The sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the gravel path. "I have something for you," Rains said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, square box and handed it to Curtis. Curtis opened it and stared at the metal inside. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Curtis didn't touch it. "This isn't for me," he said quietly. "Yes, it is," Rains replied. "It's not for what you did that day in Laos. It's for everything since, for carrying what others couldn't, for walking forward when the rest of us stopped. You said you didn't build this place, but without you, it wouldn't exist." Curtis closed the box and handed it back. "Then put it on the wall. Let the young ones see it. Maybe they'll remember it's not just about what you survive. It's about what you pass on." Rains didn't argue. He nodded and placed the box back in his coat. But before he left, he turned and said, "There's talk of naming this building after you, officially. Are you okay with that?" Curtis thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Only if you name the cafeteria after Monroe. He always said I couldn't cook. That night, the board voted unanimously. The Curtis Dean Veterans Home became official. Spring returned slowly. The oaks regained their leaves and the center's garden bloomed again. Evan, now working as a counselor, invited Curtis to speak to a new intake group. At first, Curtis declined. But later, when he saw one of the new residents sitting alone under the pergola with the same hollow gaze Evan once carried, he changed his mind. He stood at the front of the common room, hands clasped behind his back. No script. No speech. "Don't know your stories," he began. "And you don't need to know all of mine, but I'll tell you one thing. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes it's just where healing starts. This place is here because someone remembered. That's all one person remembered." He paused, looking around the room. "So I want you to do one thing. Just remember someone, doesn't matter who, just don't let them disappear." He sat down without another word. The room was quiet, not from discomfort, but from respect. That evening, Evan found him near the flagpole. "You never told me why you stayed," he said. Curtis tilted his head. "What do you mean?" "After everything. Why didn't you just disappear like the others?" Curtis smiled faintly. "Because one person didn't let me. He didn't need to say more." Evan understood. As summer crept in, so did more visitors. Not just veterans, but families, children, teenagers, spouses, siblings of those who had worn the uniform. The Curtis Dean Veterans Home had become more than a shelter or rehab facility. It had quietly transformed into a place of remembrance, where pain could coexist with healing, and where silence was honored just as much as ceremony. One Saturday afternoon, Curtis sat beneath the large oak, sharpening a pocket knife as he often did, when a young girl approached him holding a sketchbook. She was maybe 10 or 11, her father standing a few steps behind in quiet encouragement. She didn't speak at first, just held out the open book, revealing a pencil sketch of Curtis sitting on that very bench, looking out over the garden. Curtis studied it, then glanced up with a soft smile. "You made this?" She nodded. "My dad says you're a real hero." He looked at the drawing again. "Looks like you made me taller," he said with a wink. She giggled, and her father stepped forward, tears in his eyes. She wanted to come. "Thank you in person." Her grandfather, he was in the same unit as Monroe. He talked about a man named Curtis who saved the whole line once. "We didn't believe him for years. Thought it was just a war story." Curtis didn't answer. He just closed the sketchbook gently and handed it back. "Tell him thanks for remembering." Later that week, Curtis received a package in the mail. No. Return address. Inside, a folded document from the National Archives, a declassified report from 1971 detailing Operation Foxhound, the very mission Curtis had survived. His name appeared only once in the margins of a field note. Sergeant Dean pulled Lieutenant Monroe and Pert Sandor from perimeter breach, risked exposure, refused evac, returned to fire zone twice more. No formal commendation requested. Curtis stared at the faded ink, then set the paper down beside the urn on his shelf. Some things he thought didn't need medals, just a place to rest. In the fall, the center began construction on a new wing, a creative therapy studio where residents could paint, write, or simply sit in silence. Curtis helped design it. He insisted the room have windows that faced the west so the sunset light could flood the walls in the evening. "People should be reminded," he said, "that darkness always waits, but so does the light." At the wing's dedication, General Rains returned, this time accompanied by 2 senators and a journalist from a national paper. As expected, Curtis avoided the podium. But during the tour, the reporter caught up with him and asked, "Why did you call it a studio and not a therapy room?" Curtis didn't hesitate. "Because therapy sounds like something you do when you're broken. A studio is where you make things. This isn't about fixing people. It's about letting them build again." That quote ended up in print. And soon, similar centers across the country began modeling their programs after the Curtis Dean philosophy. Quiet restoration, service without spotlight, and the healing power of simply being seen. But even as his influence grew, Curtis remained unchanged. He still walked the grounds every morning before breakfast, still sharpened his old pocket knife, still took the same seat under the oak tree, where new names carved into the memorial bench caught the morning light. One evening, just before dusk, a car pulled up to the edge of the property. Out stepped a man in his 40s, neatly dressed, carrying an old, faded duffel bag. He hesitated before walking up the path. Curtis noticed him immediately and waited. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," the man said, clearing his throat. "My name's Daniel Monroe. I'm General Monroe's son." Curtis stood not out of obligation, but out of instinct. He extended his hand. "You look like your father." Daniel chuckled a little nervously. "He always talked about you, but he never said what you did. Just said you saved him more than once. I think he meant more than war." Curtis motioned for him to sit. They talked for hours. About Monroe's legacy, about what it meant to carry someone else's memory, and about the strange, invisible thread that bound people across decades. Before leaving, Daniel pulled a folded letter from his pocket. He left this for you too. Said not to give it to anyone else. Curtis opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, written in the same sharp script Monroe had always used. "You didn't just pull me from the fire. You carried me home." Curtis didn't speak. He just folded the paper, slid it into the pocket of his coat, and looked up at the sky. The seasons shifted again, and with winter approaching, the center prepared for its 5th anniversary. The event was kept low-key by design, just how Curtis preferred it. No stage, no live stream, no VIP seating, just veterans, families, staff, and a shared potluck beneath the glowing amber lights strung across the courtyard. Evan handled most of the planning. Curtis mostly stayed in the background, helping string the lights and set up chairs. But people still found their way to him, sharing updates, stories, and quietly placing old photos or dog tags into the center's growing memory wall. That night, just as the sun dipped below the tree line, Evan stepped up to a small mic. He didn't clear his throat or ask for attention. He just started talking. "There's a man sitting right over there," he said, pointing toward Curtis without directly naming him, "who probably doesn't want me to say anything. So I'll keep it short." A few chuckles rose from the crowd, and Curtis gave a faint smile. "I came here broken," Evan continued. "I didn't think I had anything left to offer, and no one told me to heal. They just sat with me, listened, reminded me that silence doesn't mean shame. It just means you're still standing." He paused, eyes scanning the quiet faces under the soft lights. "Most of what I've become, I owe to that man, and I know I'm not the only one. So tonight, while we celebrate this building, these programs, this progress, remember where it started. One man, one lily, one walk." Curtis didn't say anything. But later, when most of the guests had gone and the lights were being packed up, he placed a hand on Evan's shoulder and simply said, "You turned out all right." As winter deepened, a new wave of residents arrived, some younger, fresh from recent deployments, others older, finally seeking help after decades of silence. One in particular stood out. A woman in her early 60s named Marcia Wells, a retired Air Force mechanic who'd served in Desert Storm and later struggled with severe PTSD and isolation. She was blunt, guarded, and didn't engage much with the group. Curtis noticed her sitting alone in the workshop one afternoon, staring at an unfinished piece of wood on the table. He pulled up a chair beside her, didn't say anything at first, just started sanding a block of cedar next to her. After a few minutes, she spoke. "I used to fix engines, big ones, could take apart a jet blindfolded, but I can't seem to figure out how to fix myself." Curtis kept sanding, then said quietly, "Engines don't fix themselves. They just need someone who knows what to listen for." Marcia didn't reply, but the next day she was back at the bench, this time with gloves on and a sketch in hand. Word spread quickly among the residents that she was designing a new memorial sculpture for the garden, something abstract, made from old service parts, wheels, pipes, and brass fittings, a tribute, not just to those who served, but to the machines that carried them, and the hands that held those machines together. When it was finished, it stood 6 feet tall, shaped like a pair of open wings. Didn't look like anything specific, but to anyone who had ever worn a uniform, it made perfect sense. A fusion of steel and spirit. On the base, Marcia engraved her own words. "We carry more than weapons. We carry each other." Curtis stood in front of it for a long time after the unveiling. He didn't say much, just tapped the base lightly with his fingers, then nodded. The story of the sculpture made local news. But again, Curtis declined any spotlight. Instead, he made one small request, that a second plaque be added beside the first, listing the names of every resident who had contributed metal, labor, or even a single idea to the project. "No one builds alone," he said. As spring returned, so did life around the Curtis Dean Veterans Home. Cherry blossoms bloomed near the main gate, and a new generation of volunteers, college students studying social work, physical therapy, and history, started their rotations. Curtis, now in his late 80s, still walked the property each morning with his steady pace and signature quiet presence. People had stopped asking why he never slowed down. It was simply who he was. One crisp April morning, he received a letter that made him stop mid-step. It was from the Department of Defense, an official notice. Curtis Dean had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for lifetime service and contributions to veterans. The ceremony was scheduled for June in Washington, D.C., with the president himself presenting the award. Curtis stared at the letter for a long moment, then folded it and placed it back on his nightstand. He said nothing to anyone, not even Evan. It wasn't until Evan noticed the envelope tucked behind a stack of workshop blueprints that he brought it up. "You weren't going to tell me." Curtis looked up from his workbench. "Didn't seem necessary." "It's the Presidential Medal of Freedom," Evan emphasized. Curtis shrugged. "I already got what I came for." Eventually, the staff and residents convinced him to attend, not for the photo ops or fanfare, but so the story of the center could be heard on a national stage. "Fine," Curtis finally said, "but if I have to wear a suit, someone better iron it." June arrived. Fest. On the morning of the ceremony, Curtis stood in front of his mirror adjusting a tie he hadn't worn in 20 years. Marcia walked past and smirked. "You clean up all right, Sarge." At the White House, Curtis stood quietly off to the side as other recipients were called up: scientists, artists, teachers, civil rights leaders. When his name was finally announced, the president spoke not about battlefield heroism or grand gestures, but about something much harder to measure. Curtis Dean didn't just serve his country in uniform, the president said. He continued to serve through silence, through action, and through the kind of steady loyalty that doesn't seek recognition, but makes it necessary. When Curtis stepped up, the entire room stood. He accepted the medal, nodded once, and returned to his place without a speech. But afterward, when a reporter asked him what the moment meant to him, he said, "It means they listened." Finally, upon returning to the center, the residents and staff had decorated the courtyard with simple paper flags and a welcome sign that read, "Our hero came home again." Curtis shook his head, half amused, half touched. He didn't like being the center of attention, but this was different. This was family. In the weeks that followed, he was invited to speak on multiple national platforms, news shows, podcasts, military panels. He turned down nearly everyone, but he made one exception. A letter from a young high school student named Leo, who asked if he'd come speak at their Veterans Day assembly. "We don't know what real heroes look like anymore," Leo had written. "My grandpa said you'd show us." Curtis showed up. He stood in the school gym, facing rows of teenagers who had only seen war through movies and headlines. "I'm not here to talk about medals or ranks," he began. "I'm here to remind you that serving your country doesn't always happen on a battlefield. Sometimes it happens in kitchens, in shelters, in listening, in being there when no one else is." He paused, his eyes steady. "And if you ever feel like the world forgot you, it didn't. You just haven't been seen by the right person yet." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was respectful, real. That night, back at the center, Curtis sat once more beneath the old oak. The bench now had more names engraved along its frame, new additions, young names, some still serving, others gone. He rested his hand on the wood, as he always did, and looked out at the stars. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. Time, as it does, kept moving forward. The leaves turned once again, and the wind that rustled through the courtyard now carried a colder bite. Curtis had started to slow, not in spirit, but in stride. His walks around the garden took a little longer. His hands, once steady with a chisel or penknife, had begun to tremble just slightly, but he never stopped showing up, not once. On the morning of his 89th birthday, the center held a quiet gathering, coffee, donuts, a few hand-drawn cards taped to the wall. Curtis arrived at his usual time, not expecting a fuss. He didn't need one. But as he entered the common room, he paused. A large canvas hung from the wall, painted by the art therapy group. It depicted him standing beneath the old oak tree, the bench behind him, the veteran's garden in full bloom. The caption underneath read, "He walked alone so others wouldn't have to." Curtis said nothing, but his eyes lingered a long time on the painting before he gave a single, slow nod. That afternoon, while watching a few of the younger residents play chess near the windows, he received a visitor he hadn't seen in years. Colonel Jason Aldridge, now retired, walking with a cane but still wearing the bearing of a man who once commanded battalions. They greeted each other with firm, quiet handshakes. "I heard about the painting," Aldridge said. "It's too much," Curtis replied. "Not enough," Aldridge countered. They sat together for hours, reminiscing about names long gone, missions no one else would ever fully understand, and the strange peace that comes from knowing you outlived the war inside your head. Before leaving, Aldridge reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Found this in Monroe's effects," he said. "His son thought it belonged to you." Curtis opened it later that evening in the privacy of his small room. It was a photo, one he didn't know existed. It showed a much younger Curtis back in Laos, arms slung around a barely conscious Monroe, the jungle burning behind them. Scrawled on the back in Monroe's handwriting were the words, "The day I started living again." Curtis placed the photo inside the same box that held Monroe's final letter and the field journal from 1971. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't need to. The days grew quieter. Evan had taken on more responsibilities, running the centers, daily operations with calm precision, and the kind of grace Curtis had always believed in. One morning, Evan stopped by Curtis's room and found him looking out the window, cup of tea in hand. "You ever think about retirement?" Evan asked. With a soft smile, Curtis chuckled. "Son, I retired the day I came home. Everything after that's just been interest." Evan sat beside him. "We've been talking about building a second facility down south for vets who can't get up here. Same mission, same vision." Curtis nodded slowly. "Do it. But don't call it mine." Evan paused. "Then what? Should we call it?" Curtis thought for a moment. "Name it after one of them, one of the quiet ones, someone who never made it home." Plans were drawn. Funding began to gather. And the Curtis Dean Veterans Home became the first in a growing network of healing spaces across the country, each one bearing a different name, each one dedicated not to glory, but to remembrance. In the final winter, Curtis spent at the center. The oak tree was struck by lightning during a storm. It didn't fall, but the main trunk split. Staff worried it might have to come down. Curtis insisted they leave it standing. "Scars aren't reasons to quit," he said. "They're reasons to stay." And so they reinforced the trunk with steel bands, planted wildflowers around the base, and placed a small sign beside it that read, "Still Standing." That spring, Curtis passed quietly in his sleep. No drama, no hospital monitors, just silence. He was found by Evan early the next morning, seated in his chair, a white lily in his hand. His coat neatly folded over the back of the chair, the old pocket knife resting on the windowsill. The funeral was simple, as he would have wanted. No 21-gun salute, no speeches, just a gathering of those who had walked beside him. Veterans, nurses, counselors, students, family, strangers who had only ever known him as Sarge. They buried him beneath the oak, beside the bench, wrapped in the jacket he'd worn since the day he first stepped through the cemetery gates all those years ago. The plaque above his resting place read, Curtis Dean, Sergeant 19th Recon, U.S. Army. He carried the silence, so others could speak. And just like that, the final chapter closed, not with noise, but with legacy. The center didn't go quiet after Curtis passed. If anything, it pulsed stronger, more alive than ever. His absence wasn't a gap, it was a foundation. Evan often said, Curtis didn't just build this place, he seeded it. Every hallway carried traces of him. The bench under the oak was never empty. The memorial wall filled with new names, etched with the same respect he'd shown every stranger who'd walked through the gate. 3 months later, the new facility opened in North Carolina. It bore the name, the Taylor Wells Center, named after Marcia's late brother, a Marine who never returned home. It was her idea, and Curtis had approved it before he died. On opening day, she stood at the podium, tears threatening to break her voice as she said, "We remember them not because they were perfect, but because they mattered, and because someone once taught us how to carry them forward." Across the country, other facilities followed, each one named for the forgotten, the unrecognized, the quiet heroes Curtis always believed were the real backbone of military service. Each center carried his spirit, his approach. No glory, no hierarchy, just truth, healing, and honor. The original Curtis Dean Veterans Home became a historical site, not because it was grand or famous, but because it had changed lives in ways statistics couldn't explain. A small team of filmmakers created a short documentary titled The Man Who Opened the Gate. It featured testimonials from Evan, Marcia, Aldridge, and dozens of residents. One line stood out more than any other. He didn't save the world, but he saved our world. Each year on the anniversary of Curtis's passing, they held a candlelight walk through the Veterans Garden. No speeches, just a path lit with soft lanterns and the rustle of leaves in the night. At the base of the oak where Curtis was buried, someone always left a single white lily. No one ever admitted to it, but everyone knew. One year, a young Marine recruit on leave wandered into the garden alone. He sat on the bench, unfamiliar with the history. A counselor approached and asked, "Do you know who that is buried there?" The Marine shook his head. The counselor replied, "A man who was never famous, but whose silence healed more than any words could." The Marine stayed for hours. Back in D.C., the photo of Curtis in Laos, the one with Monroe, was quietly added to the National Museum of American History. It didn't hang under bright lights. It wasn't part of the main exhibit, but in a quiet corridor near a display on Vietnam veterans, it sat in a modest frame. Beneath it, a small card read, "Curtis Dean, U.S. Army Sergeant, served without ceremony, remembered without end." In the years that followed, Evan continued the work. He trained new staff, opened new branches. He often said, "Curtis left us a roadmap, we just have to keep walking." On what would have been Curtis's 90th birthday, the president sent a letter of recognition. But it was never read aloud. Instead, Evan pinned it beside the painting in the common room, the one of Curtis standing by the oak, and beneath it, in neat handwriting, he added one more line. "Not all monuments are made of stone. Some walk among us, and some never leave." The center's motto was eventually updated. No board vote, no debate. Just a quiet change on the front gate's bronze plaque, "Carry each other." That's the mission. And long after the voices faded, long after the world moved on to faster stories and louder heroes, Curtis Dean remained. Not in headlines, not in speeches, but in footsteps. In laughter around lunch tables, in tears shared between strangers, in a bench beneath an old oak tree, and in the hearts of those who learned, through his example, that real strength was never loud. It was steady, present, quiet, enduring. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know your favorite moment in the comments.